tonight we're going to begin the book of Ruth. We're going to look in particular at chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. The book of Ruth is a story about a family. It's a Jewish family, an Israelite family, a husband and a wife and 2 sons. And it's an amazing story about their faith because it begins in chapter 1 with tragedy, disaster, bad things. And then in chapter 4, it gets resolved, at least in some way. So what begins as a tragedy ends in a resolution. And then the question becomes, what happens between chapter 1 and chapter 4? What happens to the characters? Will they grow in their faith, or will their faith diminish? Will they get closer to God or further away from God because of their circumstances? And in many ways, this is a faith journey. It's a journey from a problem to a resolution. And I think that's something all of us can relate to, because all of us have had problems in our life, and all of us are going to continue to have more problems in our life. And when the problem comes, sometimes it's a shock. It's a horrible situation, and then we begin praying for a resolution, but we don't know how long it's going to take for the resolution to finally show up, and then it becomes that faith journey. What's going to happen to our faith between the time when the problem happens and God solves the problem in the future? So that's the story of the book of Ruth in a nutshell. It's a remarkable book. It's remarkable because it's called the book of Ruth, although Ruth technically is not the main character. Naomi is the main character. In many respects, this is her story. It's also remarkable because it's named after a woman. There's only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman. That's Esther and Ruth. And so that fact is unusual as well. Also, this is the only book in the Old Testament that's named after a non-Israelite. We're going to find out tonight that Ruth is a Moabite. She's not an Israelite. And we're going to look at what that means for her and what that means for the Israelites as well. So it's truly a remarkable story. The book breaks down into 4 acts. In fact, this would make a wonderful stage play with the characters, and there's 4 acts, and they correspond to the 4 chapters. So whoever divided the chapters did a really good job. So every chapter is an act, and every act has 3 scenes. So it's really easy to divide, and that's the outline that we're going to go with. And it begins with Act 1, death and emptiness. Now, that's a way to start a book. You know, it starts with a problem. It starts with tragedy striking a family. In this first act, we're going to be introduced to the main characters. We're also going to be introduced to a problem, a very serious problem, especially for Naomi. And then from that point on, we're going to look at how that problem finds a resolution. This first act begins in Bethlehem. It also ends in Bethlehem, but most of the action takes place outside of Bethlehem in actually a foreign country called Moab. So most of the action takes place in Moab, and then the journey from Moab back to Bethlehem. And in your notes, I summarized what's in that first chapter, what's in that first act. But I want to skip that because what I really want us to do is experience it as it unfolds. So I'm going to move to scene 1, which is the trip from Bethlehem to Moab. So the narrator's going to tell us a story about a family, a very common family. In fact, he doesn't even name them in verse 1. He waits until verse 2 to actually tell us their names. So he introduces this family, and it's an Israelite family, and how they handle a tragedy that shows up in their life. So let me read Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and then we're going to focus on those verses this evening. So Ruth chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So that's how the story begins. And we talked last week that most of this story is going to be dialogue between the characters, but this introduction is told by the narrator. And it all begins in verse 1, saying, "In the days when the judges ruled." So this story is an actual story. It's a real historical event that takes place during the time of the judges. So going back to the Old Testament, there was Moses leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. He brings them to the edge of the promised land, and that's when he passes away. Then Joshua takes his place. And Joshua leads the Israelites into the land of Canaan, the promised land, and they conquer most of it. Not all of it, but most of it. So now finally the people of Israel have a land that they can call their own. And then Joshua dies. And I remember the first time I was reading through the Old Testament, I go, okay, so there's Moses, then there's Joshua. Who's the next great leader? And wow, there's not a next great leader. There's this 200 years called the period of the Judges. It's about 1300 to 1100 BC. And during this time, there's 12 tribes of Israel. And every tribe is independent. So if a tribe gets attacked, they basically have to defend themselves unless they can convince some of the other tribes to come and help them. So there's no central government. There's no national army. There's 12 tribes trying to defend themselves and live for themselves. Also, it's called the period of the judges. And of course, when we think about a judge, we think about somebody wearing a black robe sitting in a courtroom. That's not the kind of judge that we're talking about. This judge is a military leader. In many ways, he's a military general. He's somebody who can lead the army to protect the Israelites, and if they get attacked, it's someone who can avenge them and get their freedom back. And that happens time and time again in the book of Judges. The book of Judges concludes with a phrase that's repeated 4 times. The phrase is, "In those days, there was no king in Israel." So whoever wrote Judges was in favor of the monarchy. Now, we also know that Samuel was not in favor of the monarchy, but whoever wrote Judges was in favor of Israel having a king. In fact, the author will say all the chaos and anarchy that we find in the book of Judges took place because Israel did not have a king. Now, if Israel had a king, then all of that would not have happened. Well, whoever wrote that book must have lived during a time when there was a good king in Israel. The first king of Israel is King Saul. And King Saul one day would get it right, turn around the next day and get it wrong. You know, so if you were cheering for King Saul, you had your highs and you had your lows. Because sometimes he would do well and sometimes he would make a mess. But after King Saul came King David. King David was Israel's greatest king. And when David was king over Israel, Israel became basically an empire. Israel ruled the entire Middle East. David's army, nobody could beat them. So apparently whoever wrote Judges must have lived during a time when Israel had a great king. Because if you read the books of 2 Samuel, the books of Kings and Chronicles, most of the kings of Israel were horrible. They were bad. They all get compared to King David, and most of them, well, they didn't do the right thing. But apparently, whoever wrote Judges lived during a time when the king did the right thing. Also, the quality of the judges seems to be going downhill. The last mentioned judge was Samson. Samson was a man who had all the potential in the world. Samson could have been the greatest character in the Old Testament. God gave him strength and power, and he could have conquered every enemy that Israel had. He could have been the one to establish the empire. But he had a problem: himself and women. Those were his two problems. And of course, we know the story of Samson and Delilah. And here is Samson, who could have been the greatest leader of Israel. At the end of the book, the Philistines have him captured. They put out his eyes. They're torturing the man, making fun of the man. And Samson prays one last time for God to give him strength. And they are in a temple of a Philistine god. And Samson has enough strength to push down the columns and collapse the building, killing himself and hundreds of Philistines. Not exactly a great leader. And that's where the book ends. So as we begin the book of Ruth, which happens right after Judges, we're thinking in terms of a king. Maybe a king can come along and rescue the people of Israel. But the book of Ruth begins with its own problem, its own catastrophe, its own nightmare, because there's a famine in the land. And in the ancient world, a famine was extremely bad news. A famine was an extreme scarcity of food affecting a large number of people. And apparently this famine stretched throughout the land of Israel. Because we also read in verse 1 that this man from Bethlehem is going to take his family to Moab, which was a foreign country. I mean, if there were places in Israel that were not experiencing a famine, it would have made sense to go there. I mean, why leave your own country if there's food in your own country? But if the famine covered the entire land of Israel, he may have thought he had no choice but to go to Moab. It was a famine, a disaster, chaos. And any time in the Old Testament you read about a famine, you know, this is about to be an interesting story. How are they going to handle the famine? And there's a question that scholars have asked: is this famine a judgment from God? Because we know in the book of Judges that the Israelites didn't do so well in their relationship with God. I mean, once they had a judge, you know, the judge could straighten them out. Then the judge dies, and the Israelites go back to worshiping other gods and goddesses. I mean, you know, they had the 10 Commandments. They could have just read the first one. You know, you shall have no other gods. Well, that's the one they kept breaking. They kept worshiping other gods and goddesses, and God warned them that if they did that He would punish them. And we have these verses in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 called the curses of the covenant, that if Israel turned away from God, that God would send in foreign nations to punish them and would also withhold the rain and cause a famine. So is the famine a judgment of God? Well, the author's a really interesting guy. I can't remember who said it, but whoever said "just the facts, ma'am," would have loved this author, because he doesn't explain anything. He just gives us the facts. There's a famine in the land. So no explanation of why it came. It's just the fact that there was a famine in the land. Chances are this famine was brought on because of drought. Another way a famine could occur And it was an interesting military tactic back in the ancient world. You would wait until harvest time. Then you would attack a country and steal all their food. And that would cause a famine for those people. So that was a very prominent military tactic. Just wait till the harvest and go and steal the other country's food and try to starve them to death. So that was one of the tactics, but there's no evidence of any military conflict, so chances are it's a lack of rain. Well, who is the man in the story? Apparently, as we begin verse 1, the main character in the story is going to be a man from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, it's interesting that the author in verse 2 will give his name, but to begin the story, he doesn't tell us his name. In fact, he simply says he's a man, and he has a wife, and he has 2 sons. Kind of a typical Jewish family. We could even say it would be a typical American family. So in other words, this is a story we can all relate to because we have a family just like this man had a family. But he is described in a very interesting way. He's described as a man from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, as Christians, we recognize Bethlehem. You know, oh little town of Bethlehem, you know, the place where Jesus was born. But this book was at least written after the time of King David. And when you mention a man from Bethlehem, many of the readers may have known about 1 Samuel 17:12. And this verse says, "Now David," meaning King David, "was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah." Israel's greatest king came from Bethlehem in Judah. So if you're reading this, you're going, wait a second. Does this story have something to do with King David? Does this man with his wife and 2 kids somehow get connected with King David, Israel's greatest king? And that's what you're thinking as you read this book. So there's the famine, and for a while they go to live, and it says in the country of Moab. The Hebrew literally says in the fields of Moab, because they wanted to go into the fields hoping to find grain. That way they could survive. They wouldn't starve. They would have food to eat. Well, let's look at where they went. They were from Bethlehem, which, by the way, Bethlehem is right here. It's the red box. You may not be able to see that, depending upon where you're seated. But Bethlehem is there, and Moab is at the bottom. Now, in order to get there, the Dead Sea was in the way. So you had to go north of the Dead Sea, and you had to cross the Jordan River, because the Jordan River comes down, and it ends right there at the Dead Sea. So you had to cross the Jordan River and then go south into the land of Moab. And that's exactly what this family did. They leave the land of Israel and they go to Moab, which raises a lot of questions. Why did they go there? Was it that they heard that there was food in Moab? Did the family get together and pray and ask God what to do, and God told them to go to Moab? Or did the man simply decide one day, I'm going to Moab and you all are coming with me because there's food there? So in other words, was this an act of faith or was it an act of unbelief? Should he have just stayed in Israel and prayed and waited for God to cause the famine to end? Or did he do the right thing by going to Moab? And again, our author, just the facts, doesn't say why he went there. It simply says that's where he went. Which raises the question, what is the relationship between the Israelites and the Moabites? Because obviously if he's going there, hopefully it's a cordial relationship at least. Well, the best way to describe the relationship between the Israelites and the Moabites is that it was a love-hate relationship. In one sense, the Moabites were distant relatives of the Israelites. So there was a connection, although the Israelites always looked down on the Moabites because of how they got their start. Remember Lot? Lot and his two daughters. Well, his two daughters decide that apparently they couldn't find a husband, so they decide to get their father drunk and have children through their father, which was incest. And both daughters do this on successive nights. The oldest daughter becomes pregnant, and she names her son Moab, and he's the father of the Moabites. And so the Israelites always looked down on them for that reason. Also, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were looking for some safe passage through the land. They promised that they weren't going to steal any crops or anything of that nature. They just wanted to pass through the land. And the Moabites said, no, can't pass through our land. Then at another point, the Moabites hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. The Moabites figured they can't defeat the Israelites in war, so what if somebody would curse the Israelites? Maybe we could win. And so they hired Balaam. Then in Judges chapter 3, there was a period of time when Moab was superior to Israel and held them in submission. But then Israel flipped the tables, and Israel won. Now it looks like there's at least a cordial relationship between the Israelites and the Moabites. At least enough so that this man feels safe in going to a foreign country with his family where he's looking for food, an opportunity to survive. Well, in verse 2, we finally get to meet these people. The man's name was Elimelech. And Elimelech has an interesting name. Technically, it means, my God is king. So God is the king. Which is interesting because at this time, Israel has no king, at least no human king. But Samuel would argue that Israel doesn't need a human king because God is supposed to be their king. And if the Israelites would simply follow God and recognize Him as their king, then God would bless the Israelites. You don't need a human king. God is your king. Well, here is Elimelech leaving the promised land, leaving God's land to go to a foreign land to find food. So he's not necessarily living up to his name. Then there's Naomi, and she's the wife. And her name means pleasant or pleasant one. And here in chapter 1, verse 2, Naomi is pleasant. Even though there's a famine, they're going to Moab, they're going to survive. She's got a smile on her face, things are good. By the end of chapter 1, Naomi wants to change her name to the bitter one. So the pleasant one becomes the bitter one. Well, the two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, we're not really sure what their names mean, but some Jewish people kind of gave them their names some meaning. Their names mean sickness and destruction. Now, who on planet Earth wants to name their kids sickness and destruction? I mean, who would do that? Usually, you name your child based upon how the pregnancy went and how the birth went, or you named your children to predict their future. And normally it was a positive name. It could be that some people were just looking back on the story and giving them meanings to their name that probably weren't attached to them at the beginning. So, this family is also described as Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. This is the second time in 2 verses that he's mentioned Bethlehem in Judah. He also mentions the Ephrathites. Yep, that was in 1 Samuel 17:12. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. So in the first two verses, this author 2 times is trying to connect this family to King David. So if you're reading this for the first time and you know the Jewish scriptures and you know about King David, you're going, wait a second. I've never heard this story about David before. What's the connection? How does this family, whose names I don't even know who they are, how do they connect with King David? And the author is piquing our curiosity. Oh, he's going to answer that, by the way, at the very end of the book. But at the moment, he's got everybody's curiosity up as to what's taking place. So we leave verse 2 by thinking that this guy named Elimelech is going to be the main character. So we're ready for his story. But there's a surprise in verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. It's like, wait a second. I thought he was going to be the main character. And now he's dead. The author doesn't say how he died. No explanation. It doesn't say how old he was. It doesn't say how long he lived in Moab until he died. It simply tells us that he died. Just the facts. Now, that raises a key question. Does Elimelech die simply from natural causes? It was his time to go. Or does he die as a result of the judgment of God? And that's a question that people have to wrestle with. Because some are thinking, God didn't tell him to leave Israel and go to Moab. He did that on his own. He should not have done that. But because he did that, God punished him by cutting his life short. Now, the author doesn't say that. But some people read that into the story. But there is one thing for sure. Elimelech is going to be buried in a foreign country. Now, people today, for the most part, I'm not sure most people care where they're buried. As long as Jesus can find me when he comes back, I don't care where you put my body. Or even if you cremate me, as long as Jesus can find me, I'm good. And yes, Jesus can find you no matter where you are. But in the ancient world, where you were buried mattered to people. And remember the story of Joseph when he gets down into Egypt? And eventually he's reconciled with his brothers and says, how's Dad doing? Jacob. And eventually they go back and have to tell Dad that, Joseph's in Egypt. And they bring Joseph from the land of Israel, which they didn't really own at the time, to Egypt. And Jacob dies in Egypt. But Jacob says to his sons, I don't want to be buried here. I want to be buried with my fathers back in the promised land that we don't own yet. And when Joseph dies in Egypt, when Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt, they grab Joseph's bones and take Joseph out of Egypt to bury him in the promised land. So in the ancient world, it mattered to you where you got buried. And it was shameful to be buried in a foreign land. Well, in verses 1 and 2, we think that Elimelech is the main character because everybody in the story is described in relationship to him. But now that changes in verse 3. Naomi is going to become the main character. And everybody is going to be described in relationship to her, including Elimelech, who is now described as Naomi's husband. Now, it would have been very normal to describe Naomi as the wife of Elimelech, but to describe Elimelech as the husband of Naomi, no, they didn't do that back then. But this author does. Because this author is giving us a clue. Well, obviously, Elimelech is not going to be the main character. He's dead. The main character is going to be Naomi. a switch has taken place in one verse. So this is a story about a woman, which in the ancient world, that was kind of unusual too. Usually, if you read ancient history, you don't hear much about the women. It's always the men, always the kings, always the leaders. But this is a story about a woman, and she's going to be the main character in this story. She loses her husband, and that's a tragedy. But all hope is not lost in verse 3, because she is left with her 2 sons. Now, back in the ancient world, if you were a man, you were the head of the family, you would leave your inheritance to your sons, in particular, the firstborn son. You would not leave your inheritance to your wife. That was unheard of back in the ancient world. You left the inheritance to your son. So if you're a woman and your husband dies, you better hope your sons take care of you, because otherwise you've got nobody to take care of you. No Social Security, no insurance policies, nothing. But she has 2 sons. And so this verse ends on a note of hope. She's got 2 sons. And for the family line, all these sons have to do is get married and have a son of their own. And their son can then carry on the family line. This is ancient world thinking. Verse 4, good news. The 2 sons, they get married. They marry Moabite women. One named Orpah, the other named Ruth. So they're living in the land of Moab, and they marry these Moabite women. And one of them is named Orpah. And her name can mean back of the neck, cloud, or perfume. And most have suggested that back of her neck is what her name means. And it has a very negative connotation in the story, because they're going to claim that Orpah is going to turn her neck against her mother-in-law. We would say that she turned her back on her mother-in-law. But it's interesting that in the story itself, Naomi has nothing negative to say about Orpah. She only has good things to say about these Moabite women. But people reading back into the story suggest it that way. Ruth, we really don't know what her name means, but people have suggested that it could mean friend or companion, and certainly she was a friend and companion to Naomi. It can also mean refreshment and satiation. And yes, Ruth is the refreshment, a breath of fresh air to Naomi, who's going to help solve her problem. But again, that's reading her name back into the story. At this point, we are not told which boy married which girl. But in Ruth chapter 4, verse 10, we learned that Ruth was the wife of Mahlon, who was probably the firstborn. So Ruth and Mahlon got married. Now, it's interesting that their time in Moab is mentioned for the 3rd time in 4 verses. In verse 1 it says, they went to live for a while in the country or fields of Moab. Verse 2 indicates they went to Moab and lived there. And verse 4 says they lived there about 10 years. Now, the 10 years, that's a long time. Chances are the famine ended in Israel a long time ago. But apparently this family moved to Moab, kind of liked it there, and stayed there. So their temporary stay turned into almost a permanent residence, lasting over 10 years. Now, the 10 years can refer to the time of the boys. They married the girls, and then they lived another 10 years in Moab. It can refer to that. Or it can refer to the entire time that the family of Elimelech was in Moab. So they were in Moab at least for 10 years, maybe longer, because most think this 10 years refers to the time that they lived in Moab after getting married. Now, there's a major debate in this story, and it has everything to do with those first 4 words. They married Moabite women. The question is that okay for 2 Jewish boys to marry Moabite women? Now, the author, again, just the facts, doesn't give his opinion, just states the fact that they got married. Now, in the Old Testament, there are times when marrying foreign women was frowned upon, and other times when marrying foreign women was condemned. So there are some scholars who believe that these 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, did wrong by getting married to Moabite women. And they give 5 reasons. And the first one doesn't appear in the English text. In the NIV, which is the translation I'm using, it simply says they married Moabite women. Literally, in the Hebrew, it would say that they lifted or carried a woman. And to lift or carry a woman is an idiom for getting married. Although it's not the most common one, the most common idiom to say they got married is they took a woman. So if you take a woman, that means you got married to her. But instead of saying they took a woman, the author writes they lifted or carried a woman. And that same phrase is used in the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah to refer to what they call illegitimate marriages. An illegitimate marriage because an Israelite married a foreign person. So the word itself that's used for marriage may give a clue that these boys did wrong in marrying Moabite women. A second reason is there are stipulations in the law of Moses, especially Deuteronomy, that say that Israelites are only to marry Israelites. They are not to marry people from foreign countries. A great example of this, of getting it wrong, was King Solomon, who is known for his wisdom and, his great wealth. And boy, they had lots of gold coming into the land of Israel when Solomon was king. But towards the end of his life, Solomon started marrying, and they're probably politically arranged marriages. He married a bunch of foreign women. And these foreign women brought into Israel the worship of their gods. And it was in competition for the worship of the true God of heaven. And towards the end of his life, Solomon's heart was turned toward other gods because of these wives. And that was the reason why the law of Moses said only marry an Israelite. Because if you marry a woman from another country back then, every country had their own god and goddess who was part of the land. And they may bring that into the land of Israel and turn the hearts of the people away from God. The greatest example and the worst example, of course, was Jezebel, which we talked about last week. She was a priestess of Baal. And when Ahab married her and she became the queen of Israel, she tried to turn Israel, the entire country, over to the worship of Baal and gave the prophet Elijah a really rough time throughout his life. So that was the reason why you weren't supposed to marry foreign wives. Also in Deuteronomy, it talks about the people of Israel eventually going into exile and the heartache of seeing your sons and daughters getting married to foreigners because they were out of the land of Israel. Number 4 is really interesting. We know that Mahlon and Chilion married Orpah and Ruth, and they were married for at least 10 years. They had no children in 10 years, which was very unusual back in the ancient world. And we're not told if, maybe there was something wrong with Mahlon and Chilion, or if Ruth and Orpah were barren. We don't know, and maybe they couldn't know back then. They didn't have the medical science to know the answer to that. 10 years and no children. Was God cursing them in some way? And then the fifth reason, to kind of jump ahead, in verse 5, the two boys both die, leaving no heir. So many have argued that Elimelech disobeyed God by going to Moab, and he died. Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women, breaking the law of Moses, sinning against God, and God took their lives, leaving no heir. And some see the story that way. There are others who see the story a little differently. They see the tragedies in these first 5 verses as simply a series of unfortunate events. Things that happen to people that we can't explain, that we have no answers to. Now, difficult circumstances led them to the land of Moab. And if you're going to live in the land of Moab, and you're a boy, a teenager, young man, chances are you're going to marry a Moabite. Because who else is in Moab but Moabite women? And so, this kind of makes sense. If you're going to live there, that's who you're going to marry. Naomi becomes the family matriarch. Naomi could have said to her boys, "You're to only marry an Israelite." And if that was Naomi's opinion, once Elimelech died, the smartest thing for them to have done was to go back to the land of Israel so that the boys could find wives among the Israelite women. But Naomi doesn't do that. Naomi doesn't have anything negative to say about Ruth or Orpah. I mean, Naomi could have said, "Oh, you Moabite women, my sons married you and now God has taken their lives because of you." She doesn't say that. In fact, she has a lot of sympathy for the Moabite women. She cares about them. She doesn't blame them for anything. So this could be just life. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Verse 5, I already hinted at this one. Mahlon and Chilion also died. It doesn't say if they died at the same time. It just simply says they died. I'm not sure what the time frame is between one boy dying and the other boy dying. This is a double blow, though, to Naomi. She not only loses one of her sons, which would have been tragic, she loses them both, which was a double tragedy. And the big idea now is, this is the end of the family line. It was Elimelech and his 2 sons, and now the family line is going to die because there's no male to pass on the inheritance to. I mean, this is a story about 6 people, 3 males and 3 females. And in 5 verses, all 3 males are dead. Now it's a story about 3 women. And the family line doesn't exist. It's finished, or so it seems. Now, in the ancient world, for a woman, her status came from being a wife and giving birth to a son. That's how she found her status. But for Naomi, she's no longer a wife because Elimelech's dead. She's no longer a mother because both of her sons are dead. Here's a woman living in Moab. A woman in the ancient world living in Moab. Now she has no family. I mean, she started in verse 1, she had a family. Now in verse 5, her entire family's gone. She's in a foreign country, no family, no support, and apparently no hope. That's where we leave her in verse 5. in absolute tragedy. What is Naomi going to do? In the book, there's no finger pointing. I mean, again, the author just gives us the facts. He doesn't say that Elimelech did wrong. He doesn't say that the two boys did wrong. He simply tells the story of what happens in their lives. This is a typical Jewish family. And yes, there's clues that they have ties to King David. But for the most part, it's a typical Jewish family that's just experienced massive suffering and tragedy. And perhaps everyone's looking around at each other, especially Naomi, and asking the question, why? And haven't we all done that? In fact, there's an entire book in the Bible written about that. It's the book of Job. When tragedy strikes Job, and Job's looking around going, I have no idea why this happened. But then his three buddies show up. And for many chapters of very interesting poetry, they try to convince Job that he sinned, and that's why this happened. But Job says, no, I didn't sin. I didn't do anything wrong. I did nothing to bring this on myself. There's not a specific sin that I can tie to this tragedy. And I think there's part of being human that when something goes wrong, we ask why. And every time you ask your brain a question, your brain wants to try to answer it for you. And so your brain is saying, okay, why did this tragedy come on you? Okay, wait a second. What did you do wrong? Because certainly there must be a connection between your wrong and this bad thing that happened to you. And somehow, if we can make that connection, maybe we feel better about it, or at least we have something of an answer, even if we don't like the answer. And I think when in this story, there's this natural tendency on the part of some people to say, yeah, Elimelech died. Why did he die? Oh, yeah, he must have done something wrong. Well, what wrong did he do? Well, he left Israel and went to Moab. We may not like that, but at least we have an answer. And for the two boys, why did they die without leaving an heir? Well, they married Moabite women. And it's an answer. We may not like the answer, but it is an answer. The thing that drives us crazy is when we don't have an answer. Why did that happen to me? Why did that happen to my friend? Why is it that we prayed for two people with a similar disease? One got better and one passed away. Why? We don't like not being able to answer the why question. But the book of Job actually teaches us a very important lesson. If you read the book of Job, you know why tragedy struck Job. It's in the first two chapters. It's this conversation between God and the devil. But do you know who doesn't know about that conversation? Job. Do you know who never finds out about that conversation? Job. I mean, that drove me nuts when I read the book for the first time. It's like, just tell the guy what happened. But he never finds out. But how many of our why questions ever really get answered? Not too many. Sometimes when tragedy happens, bad things happen, setbacks happen, we live in a broken, fallen world. And bad things do happen. And the question is not, why did it happen? The real question is, what's going to happen to my faith now? What's Naomi going to do? And by the way, I'll give you a clue as we get to the end of chapter 1. Do you know who Naomi blames this whole thing on? God. She's mad at God. She's not mad at her husband. She's not mad at her sons. She's mad at God. There's this process that we go through. when bad things happen. And at the end of the day, the goal is for your faith to grow and to get stronger. But you have to go through the journey for that to happen. Naomi's about to go through a journey, and we're going to go through the journey with her, step by step, thinking not only of her story, but of our own stories as well. Because we may not have had it as bad as Naomi had it in 5 verses, but we've had some stuff happen, and we're trying to bring resolution to that. And Naomi's going to try to do the same thing. So I think it's wrong for us to immediately say, oh, well, that happened to them because they're bad. In fact, Jesus, in talking about some people who died in the New Testament times, basically said, don't think that those 2 were the worst people in Israel that happened to them. In fact, Jesus says, if you don't repent, you're all going to perish. Meaning, bad things happen. And the question is, what is it going to do to my faith? Especially my faith in God. And that's the real question. Think about that this week. And we'll pick up in chapter 1, verse 6 next week. Heavenly Father, what an incredible story. A sad story. A tragic story in the first 5 verses. Father, it's a story that makes us wonder, makes us question. And since the author doesn't answer any of our questions, we just are left with our questions. But Father, through it all, it reminds us of life. Things happen to us every day, and sometimes we wonder, why did that happen? Why did you, God, let that happen? And we don't know the answer. Oh, we try to come up with one, but at the end of the day, we don't know. We have no answer, and that bugs us that we don't. But Father, may that fact help us in our journey to make sense of things, and in our journey to grow our faith in you. May the difficulties of our life cause us to run to you, not run away from you. May it grow our faith, not eliminate our faith in you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.